Maria Thompson had spent nearly half her life behind the stoves of the same restaurant in Portland, Oregon. At 46, she carried herself with the quiet dignity of someone who had seen kitchens rise and fall, yet never lost her devotion to food. Her hands bore the faint scars of decades of chopping, stirring, baking, and plating, but they were also steady, hands that moved with the precision of muscle memory and the warmth of care. To her, cooking was not a job, but a way of speaking, a language she had mastered long ago. She had started humbly, 2 decades earlier, as an assistant in the kitchen. In those days, she did the unglamorous work, peeling onions, scrubbing pots, staying late after shifts to wipe down stainless steel counters. Over the years, as chefs came and went, Maria remained. Her loyalty and skill earned her the title of head chef more than a decade ago. Since then, she had become the soul of the restaurant. The staff relied on her steady presence, and regular customers asked for her by name. The restaurant itself reflected Portland's charm, intimate, warm, with brick walls and a quiet view of the street outside. It had survived food trends and economic storms, largely because the food Maria crafted spoke for itself. But it wasn't only her talent that kept things together. The owner, David Callahan, had his share of brilliance too. David, now 50, was a man of contrasts. He loved food with a passion equal to Maria's, and when inspired, he could dream up dishes that brought crowds through the doors. He had a boyish smile, an easy laugh, and the kind of charisma that made people forgive him more than they should. Yet behind the charm lay a weakness that had shadowed him for years: cards. Poker, blackjack, whatever the game, he couldn't resist the rush of risk. Maria had watched him stumble in and out of trouble many times. There had been nights when paychecks were delayed for weeks because David had played too deeply into losses. She remembered the whispers of the staff, the frustration that built up when bills went unpaid. And yet, somehow, David always made things right in the end. Money would appear, debts would be cleared, and wages would come with bonuses, as if to soothe the hurt. The staff, weary but loyal, stayed. Maria, more than anyone, forgave him, though she never forgot. It wasn't that she excused his recklessness, but she had known him long enough to see more than his faults. David wasn't greedy. He wasn't cruel. He was, at his core, a man adrift, someone who could be brilliant when he focused, but who too often let himself drown in his own flaws. And perhaps because Maria had spent years anchoring herself in the heat of the kitchen, she allowed herself to anchor him too. On that particular morning, Maria pushed open the back door of the restaurant with her usual tote slung over her shoulder. The autumn air outside had been crisp, tinged with the earthy smell of wet leaves. Inside, the familiar scent of yeast and simmering stock should have been comforting. But as she stepped across the threshold, she felt a ripple of unease. Something was off. It wasn't visible at first glance. The kitchen looked the same. Knives lined in their racks, copper pans gleaming dully under fluorescent light, prep stations ready for the day ahead. Yet Maria's instincts, sharpened by years of weathering both quiet mornings and stormy nights in this place, told her something was waiting. She paused with her hand resting on the counter, listening. The muffled sound of staff voices carried faintly from the front of the house, hushed and clustered, unlike the normal bustle of setting tables and brewing coffee. Her heart tightened. Staff only gathered like that when news had traveled fast, and never good news. Maria straightened her shoulders, adjusting her chef's coat. Whatever it was, she would face it. She had spent too many years here to be easily shaken. But as she walked toward the dining room, her steps were heavier than usual, as though her body already knew the weight of what her ears had yet to hear. The day was beginning like any other, yet the air in the restaurant felt changed, thick with an invisible tension. Maria's unease deepened with each step, the certainty forming inside her that this would not be just another morning in her kitchen. In the dining room, Maria found a small knot of waiters and bussers gathered near the hostess stand. They weren't setting tables or polishing glasses. Instead, they stood in a circle, whispering with pale faces, their voices tense, their hands twisting napkins or tugging at sleeves. The moment Maria appeared, the group went silent. Her brow furrowed. Why isn't anyone working? What's going on? A young waitress, barely out of college, shifted nervously. Maria, you haven't heard? Heard what? Her voice sharpened. She set her tote bag on a nearby chair, arms crossing. David, the girl began and then faltered. Someone else finished for her. Blurting it out as though pulling off a bandage, he lost the restaurant. In a poker game. Last night. The word struck Maria like a blow to the chest. For a heartbeat, she simply stared, waiting for someone to laugh, to shake their head, to admit it was some cruel rumor. But the silence that followed told her all she needed to know. Her throat tightened. Where is he? In his office, the hostess whispered. Maria didn't waste another second. She turned on her heel, her shoes clicking sharply against the wooden floor as she strode toward the back hallway. Every step felt heavier than the last. At David's office door, she didn't bother knocking. She pushed it open, her eyes locking onto him at once. He was slumped behind his desk, a cigarette burning low between his fingers, a gray haze curling around his face. He looked up briefly, then dropped his gaze as though unable to meet hers. Tell me it isn't true, Maria said, her voice quiet but edged with steel. David gave a hollow laugh and gestured vaguely with the cigarette. I'm guessing they already told you at the front. David, she pressed, stepping into the room, what have you done? For a moment, he said nothing. Then he ground the cigarette into the ashtray with slow finality. I made a mistake. His voice was rough, almost broken. I thought I could win it back. Thought I had the cards, but I didn't. And now, he exhaled, leaning back in his chair, eyes fixed on the ceiling as if hoping the plaster could swallow him whole. Now the place is gone. He'll be here tomorrow morning to sign the papers. Maria's stomach dropped. Tomorrow. It was that immediate, that final. You promised me, she whispered, her anger trembling beneath the words. You swore you were done with this. I know. His voice cracked. He leaned forward, burying his face in his hands. I know, Maria, but I slipped, and there's no undoing it. For a long, heavy silence, Maria simply stood there. Her chest ached with conflicting feelings, fury, sorrow, disbelief. She wanted to shake him, to scream at him for destroying everything they had built together. But she also saw the defeat in his posture, the way his shoulders sagged like a man twice his age. It wasn't greed that had led him here, nor malice. It was his own weakness, the flaw that had always haunted him. And there was nothing she could do to change it. Her lips pressed into a thin line. She turned without another word and left the office, her heart hammering, her mind spinning. Back in the kitchen, Maria tied on her apron and reached for a cutting board. The familiar rhythm of her work, the scrape of knife against wood, the scent of garlic beneath her blade, steadied her hands if not her spirit. She moved briskly, focusing on each task, each motion, as if the discipline of cooking could shield her from the storm raging inside. But even as she chopped and stirred, her thoughts ran in circles. Tomorrow, everything she had given 20 years to would belong to someone else. Tomorrow, this kitchen might no longer be hers. Her staff cast anxious glances at her from the corners of the room, waiting to see if she would break. But Maria did not falter. She kept her back straight, her hand steady. Only her eyes, fixed on the simmering pot before her, betrayed the truth. Behind their calm surface was a woman reeling from betrayal and bracing for the inevitable. And though the kitchen hummed with ordinary sounds, the clatter of pans, the hiss of steam, Maria felt as if she were standing at the edge of a cliff, the ground trembling beneath her feet. Tomorrow was coming, and with it a fall she could not stop. By late afternoon, the restaurant had fallen into an uneasy lull. Staff moved about the dining room in stilted motions, waiting for something they did not want to face but could not avoid. The news had spread David had gambled everything away, and though the papers weren't yet signed, the man who had claimed the restaurant was already on his way. Though the official handover wasn't scheduled until the next morning, Tyler arrived early, already acting as if the place was his. The front doors swung open just before dusk. A group of young men spilled inside, loud and swaggering, their laughter cutting sharply through the quiet air. At their center walked Tyler Callahan, David's 30-year-old nephew. He wore designer sneakers, a leather jacket thrown carelessly over his shoulders, and an expression that announced he had nothing to prove. His eyes scanned the space with the restless boredom of someone who believed the world already belonged to him. "Well," he drawled, his voice carrying across the dining room, "this is the place I've inherited. Looks quaint." His friends chuckled, already drifting toward the bar as if it were theirs. Maria stepped forward instinctively, her chef's coat still marked with the traces of the day's work. She didn't say a word, but her presence alone demanded respect. Tyler's gaze landed on her, and his smirk widened. "And who's this?" he asked, gesturing toward her with a flick of his hand. "I'm the head chef," Maria replied evenly. Her voice was calm, but inside her chest her heart pounded. "The head chef," Tyler repeated mockingly. He let out a laugh, turning to his friends. "More like an old relic. What is she, 50? 60? Time for some new blood, don't you think?" The group erupted in cruel laughter, and Maria felt heat rise to her face. She had been called many things in her career: strict, demanding, stubborn, but never dismissed so thoughtlessly, never reduced to nothing more than an insult about her age. Tyler stepped closer, lowering his voice just enough to make the words sting. "Your time's up, old lady. Go home. We'll find someone younger who knows what's trending. This isn't your kitchen anymore." For a moment, the room froze. The wait staff, the bartenders, even David, who had emerged silently from his office, stood rooted to the floor. Everyone seemed to hold their breath, waiting to see how Maria would respond. She could have argued. She could have demanded the respect she had earned through decades of labor, through nights spent building this place with her own two hands. But something inside her broke at the contempt in his eyes. She realized, with sudden clarity, that no words would matter. He saw her as nothing. Maria unknotted the apron from her waist with slow, deliberate movements. She removed her chef's hat and set both down on the counter. Then, with her head held high, she walked past Tyler and out through the swinging doors. It wasn't until she stepped into the evening air that her composure cracked. Tears blurred her vision as she hurried down the sidewalk, fumbling for her phone in her pocket, only to realize it was the only thing she had taken with her. Her purse, her keys, even the small photographs she kept in her locker, all left behind in the kitchen that had defined her life. She walked blindly, her chest tight with humiliation. The city lights flickered on one by one, but she barely noticed. Portland's familiar streets felt foreign now, each step carrying her further from the place she had called home for 20 years. By the time she reached her apartment, her legs ached and her face was wet with tears. She collapsed onto the couch, burying her face in her hands. The apartment felt unbearably quiet. For years, she had measured her life by the rhythms of the kitchen, the clang of pots, the hiss of steam, the shouts of line cooks. Now the silence pressed in on her like a weight. For a long time she sat there, trembling with anger and grief. Then, slowly, she pulled herself upright. Sitting in that silence would only break her further. She needed to move, to breathe, to remind herself that the world still existed beyond the walls of that restaurant. She changed into jeans and a jacket, wiped her face, and stepped back outside. The night air was cool, laced with the smell of rain on pavement. She began to walk with no destination in mind, letting the rhythm of her steps and the hum of the city steady her heart. Somewhere behind her, the restaurant's doors had closed, and with them, the life she had built. Ahead lay only the uncertainty of what would come next. The hours passed slowly in her apartment, each tick of the clock pulling Maria deeper into a restlessness she couldn't shake. She tried lying down, but the silence pressed too heavily against her chest. She turned on the television, but the voices on the screen blurred into meaningless sound. For years, her nights had been claimed by the rhythm of the restaurant. The rush of orders, the clatter of plates, the hum of conversation in the dining room. To sit alone now felt unbearable, like being cut adrift from the very pulse that had sustained her life. Close to midnight, Maria stood and grabbed her jacket. The thought had been tugging at her since she walked out. Her belongings were still in the restaurant. Her purse, her keys, even her locker with a few personal keepsakes. She couldn't leave them behind, not in that place where strangers now roamed as if they owned it. More than that, she simply couldn't stay still any longer. The streets of Portland were alive with late-night wanderers. Couples strolled arm in arm, laughter spilling from nearby bars. Bicycles flashed past with streaks of neon. Maria walked quickly, her breath visible in the cool air, her heart pounding with something between anger and grief. By the time she reached the familiar brick exterior of the restaurant, her steps slowed. Light still glowed inside, spilling faintly through the windows. She hesitated, pressing herself into the shadows of the alley. That was when she saw them. A few of Tyler's friends, the same rowdy companions who had swaggered in earlier, slipping out the side door in a hurry. They muttered to each other, glancing back nervously before disappearing into the night. Maria frowned. Their exit didn't look like the carefree swagger she had seen hours before. Something about the way they rushed off unsettled her. She approached the back entrance. The door wasn't fully closed. It hung slightly ajar. Caution prickled at her, but curiosity pushed harder. She slipped inside, her footsteps silent on the tiled floor. The restaurant was eerily quiet. Chairs were askew. A glass sat half empty on the bar. She moved cautiously toward the dining room, her eyes scanning the space. That was when she saw him, Tyler Callahan. He was slumped forward over one of the tables, his head resting on his arm, an abandoned bottle at his side. For a moment, Maria exhaled sharply through her nose. Of course, drunk and careless, she should have turned and walked away, let him wallow in the mess he had created. But something stopped her. Maybe it was instinct, or maybe it was the nagging sense that the silence in the room wasn't right. She stepped closer, her shoes clicking lightly against the floor. "Tyler," she said cautiously, her voice carrying in the empty space. "You need to lock the doors before you pass out in here." He didn't move. Maria's frown deepened. She reached out, intending only to shake his shoulder lightly, to wake him enough that she could grab her things and leave. But as her hand touched him, his body tilted unnaturally, sliding off the table. Maria caught him instinctively and gasped. His skin was clammy, his lips tinged a frightening shade of blue. His chest rose only faintly, shallow and uneven. He wasn't drunk. He was in crisis. "God," Maria whispered, adrenaline flooding her. Her hands trembled as she lowered him carefully onto the floor. She had worked kitchens her whole life, but she wasn't a nurse, wasn't a doctor. Still, training from years ago, those mandatory CPR sessions every employee had to take, rose sharply in her memory. Her phone was in her pocket. She dialed 911 with shaking fingers. "This is 911. What's your emergency?" "There's a man. He's collapsed," she said quickly, forcing the words out. "He's not breathing right. His lips are blue. I think it's his heart. Please, send someone fast." The dispatcher's voice was calm, steady. "Ma'am, stay on the line. Help is on the way. Do you know how to begin CPR?" "Yes," Maria said, kneeling beside Tyler. "Yes, I do." She tilted his head back, checking his airway, pressing her ear close to his mouth. The faint, uneven gasps made her chest tighten. She laced her fingers together and began chest compressions, counting under her breath, her own heartbeat racing with every push. The restaurant that had been filled with humiliation only hours before now echoed with the sound of her voice, steady and urgent, as she fought to keep life inside the body of the man who had tried to strip her of her dignity. Maria didn't stop to think about irony or justice. In that moment, instinct had taken over, and though her arms ached and her tears blurred her vision, she pressed harder, refusing to let him slip away. Somewhere in the distance, faint at first, the wail of sirens cut through the Portland night. The sirens grew louder until red and blue lights washed over the restaurant walls. Paramedics rushed in, their voices brisk and practiced. Maria stepped back, her arms shaking from the effort of compressions, her chest heaving with adrenaline. She watched as they checked Tyler's pulse, applied oxygen, and prepared to transport him. One of the medics gave her a brief nod. "You did the right thing," he said. "You may have saved his life." And then they were gone. Tyler on the stretcher, the team sweeping him into the night, leaving only silence in their wake. Maria stood frozen for a moment, her palms damp, her knees weak. It was only when the last echo of the sirens faded that she fumbled for her phone again. There was only one person she needed to call. David answered on the second ring. His voice was groggy, heavy with despair. "Maria." "You need to come," she said. "Now. It's Tyler. He collapsed here. The ambulance just left." A pause, then a sharp inhale. "I'll be right there." 15 minutes later, David appeared, his hair disheveled, his coat thrown hastily over his shoulders. His eyes darted around the restaurant, taking in the overturned chair, the half-empty glass still on the table, the faint trace of chaos left behind. "What happened?" he asked. Maria told him in clipped words, too drained to dress the story in details. She had found Tyler slumped over. She had called 911. She had kept him alive until the paramedics arrived. As she spoke, David listened in silence, his hands braced against the edge of a table as if he needed the wood beneath his fingers to steady him. David rubbed his temples, his eyes red-rimmed, not from lack of sleep, but from something deeper. Shame, maybe, or fear. "He's just a kid," he whispered, more to himself than to Maria. "I handed him the keys to this place without knowing he was falling apart. I should have seen it." When she finished, a heavy stillness settled over them. The restaurant, usually filled with the clatter of dishes and the hum of conversation, now felt cavernous and hollow. Only the hum of the refrigerator in the back broke the quiet. David lowered himself into a chair, motioning for her to sit across from him. For a long while, neither spoke. They simply sat there, the weight of the night pressing down on both of them. Finally, David gave a tired laugh, one without joy but not without feeling. "You've always been stronger than me, Maria. I lose everything in a game of cards, and you're the one holding it all together. You always have been." Maria looked at him, her expression soft but weary. "Strength isn't enough to fix everything, David." He leaned back, exhaling. His eyes searched hers, as though he were about to confess something deeper. And then, almost carelessly, the words slipped out. "Marry me, Maria." For a moment, she thought she'd misheard. She blinked, sitting straighter. "What did you just say?" He gave a half-shrug, almost sheepish. "Marry me. I mean, why not? You're the only person who's ever believed in me. You're the only reason this place has survived as long as it has. We could stop pretending we're just tied to this restaurant. We could be tied to each other." Maria let out a startled laugh. "You're proposing in the middle of the night, after your nephew nearly died in this dining room." David smiled faintly, though his eyes shone with a vulnerability she had rarely seen. "I'm serious, Maria. I don't want to lose you. Not after everything." Her first instinct was to brush it off, to call it a joke born from exhaustion. But as she studied him, his slumped shoulders, the way his voice cracked slightly at the edges, something shifted inside her. He wasn't playing. He wasn't trying to charm his way out of another mistake. For once, he was simply being honest. Maria's lips curved into the smallest of smiles. You have the worst timing imaginable. Maybe, he admitted, but do I have your answer? She let the silence stretch a heartbeat longer before she said, softly, yes, David, you do. They left the restaurant together as dawn broke over Portland. The streets glistened with last night's rain, the air damp and cool against their skin. Side by side, their hands found each other naturally, fingers entwining. For the first time in years, Maria felt something other than weariness. She felt the fragile spark of possibility, the whisper of a life that could still be remade. And as they walked together into the gray morning, the heaviness of the night began to lift, replaced by a quiet warmth neither of them had expected. Morning light broke through the wide windows of the restaurant, painting the dining room in a pale wash of gray. The night had left Maria and David drained, though neither had slept. They sat at one of the corner tables, 2 cups of untouched coffee cooling between them, their silence heavy but not uncomfortable. The quiet was broken by the creak of the front door. Maria looked up, expecting perhaps one of the staff or even the landlord. Instead, a tall man in a perfectly cut suit stepped inside. His presence filled the room instantly, not because of volume, but because of the authority he carried like a second skin. His silver hair caught the morning light, his sharp eyes scanning the space with purpose. "Mr. Callahan," David murmured, rising halfway to his feet. His voice carried both surprise and dread. Maria's breath caught. She recognized him almost immediately. Senator William Callahan, a figure often seen on local news broadcasts, a man who spoke from podiums with the weight of the state behind him. And he was Tyler's father. The senator's gaze softened as it settled on Maria. "You're the one," he said quietly. "You're the woman who called 911. The one who kept my son alive." Maria shifted uncomfortably under the gravity of his attention. "I just did what anyone would have done." "No," Williams said firmly. "Not anyone. Most people would have walked away. I owe you more than I can ever repay." He drew out a chair and sat with the air of someone accustomed to being obeyed, though his tone remained measured. He glanced briefly at David, whose face was pale, his hands tightening on the back of a chair. "I've spoken with the doctors," the senator continued. "Tyler's condition has been unstable for some time. He should have had surgery years ago, but his mother," his words caught, and he shook his head as though brushing away the past. "What matters now is that you gave us another chance with him. For that, I am deeply grateful." Maria inclined her head, still unsettled by the formality of his gratitude. But David, clearly struggling, finally spoke. "Senator, about the restaurant." "Tyler," William's sharp eyes cut to him. "Yes, I've heard whispers already." David swallowed. "I lost it. In a game. Last night. He was supposed to take ownership this morning." "The papers, they're not signed," the senator interrupted. "No," David admitted. William leaned back, the faintest trace of relief crossing his face. Then his expression hardened into one of cold authority. "Then listen carefully, David. There is no deal. There is no transfer. You are still the legal owner of this place, and you will remain so. Whatever arrangement was made over a table of cards has no bearing here." The words seemed to release something in the room. Maria exhaled slowly, only then realizing how tightly she'd been holding her breath. David sagged into his chair, his face etched with disbelief and something like hope. William reached into his jacket and withdrew a card. He set it gently on the table between them. "This has my direct number. If you need anything at all, you call me. Consider it the smallest measure of repayment for saving my son's life." Maria stared at the card, its embossed lettering gleaming in the morning light. The weight of what had just happened pressed down on her. A man who could have dismissed her entirely was instead offering his hand his gratitude. It felt like a lifeline after days of drowning. The senator stood, buttoning his suit jacket with deliberate calm. "I will take care of Tyler." He will get the medical attention he should have had long ago. As for you, his eyes moved between Maria and David. Protect this place. It deserves better than to be gambled away. And with that, he turned and walked out, his polished shoes clicking steadily against the floor until the door swung shut behind him. For a long moment, neither Maria nor David spoke. The card still lay on the table, glinting softly, like a promise that everything had not yet been lost. Maria finally looked at David. Do you understand what just happened? David gave a disbelieving laugh, rubbing his hand over his face. We just got our lives back, Maria. And for Maria, who had walked home in despair just hours ago, the shift felt almost unreal, like stepping from storm into sunlight. The senator's departure left a silence that felt almost unreal, as though the air itself had shifted. The card he had left gleamed faintly under the morning light, its presence a reminder that the storm hanging over the restaurant had broken in their favor. For the first time in days, maybe years, David's face showed something other than exhaustion or regret. He sat back in his chair, staring around the dining room as though seeing it anew. Maria, he said softly, I don't think I'll ever be able to repay you for what you did last night. For saving Tyler, for standing by me when you had every reason to walk away. Maria's eyes softened, though her voice was steady. I didn't do it for you, David. I did it because it was the right thing to do. I know, he said quickly, almost with a smile, and that makes it mean even more. He leaned forward, folding his hands on the table. But I can't keep pretending this place was ever just mine. Without you, there wouldn't have been a restaurant to lose in the first place. You've carried it for 20 years. She tilted her head, unsure of where he was leading. I want to give you half of it, David continued. Legally. The papers, the ownership, everything. It's the least I can do. You deserve it more than I do. For a moment, Maria was silent. The word stunned her, not because she doubted his sincerity, but because she knew how rare it was for David to relinquish anything. This restaurant had been his pride, his folly, his entire identity. And now here he was, offering half of it as a gift. Her lips parted to respond, but before she could, David smirked faintly, his tone shifting. Although, he added, there might be a simpler way. Instead of splitting papers and lawyers and contracts, I could just marry you. Then we wouldn't have to divide anything. Maria blinked, then let out a startled laugh. David Callahan, that is the most unromantic proposal I've ever heard. He shrugged, though his eyes shone with a nervous glint. I'm a practical man, Maria. Always have been. Practical, she teased, arching an eyebrow. You nearly gambled away everything you own. That's your idea of practical. David chuckled, rubbing the back of his neck. Fair point, but you know what I mean. His expression softened, losing its usual armor of humor. I don't want you to carry this place alone anymore. I don't want you to carry me alone anymore, either. I want us. For real this time. Something inside Maria shifted. For years, she had stood at his side as colleague, confidant, sometimes even as caretaker. She had seen him at his worst, forgiven him more than most people ever would. And yet, she had never let herself imagine a future with him beyond the boundaries of the kitchen. Now, as he looked at her with that mixture of sheepishness and sincerity, she felt something bloom where only weariness had lived before. She laughed again, but this time it was softer, warmer. You really are terrible at this, you know. But as she looked at him, really looked, she saw the fear behind the smirk, the way his fingers fidgeted with the edge of the table. He wasn't asking out of convenience. He was asking out of hope. And for the first time, Maria allowed herself to hope too. Terrible at what? At being romantic. Then teach me, he said simply. The silence stretched, but it was no longer heavy. Maria leaned back, a smile lingering on her lips. For the first time in what felt like forever, she saw not only the man who stumbled, but also the man who kept trying to stand again. And she realized that, despite everything, she wanted to keep standing with him. The tension that had gripped her chest since yesterday eased. In its place came a fragile but steady warmth, a sense that maybe, just maybe, there was still a future worth holding on to. David reached across the table, his hand covering hers. She didn't pull away. For two people who had walked through years of loneliness and mistakes, the gesture was simple. Yet it carried the weight of something long overdue, the recognition that they no longer had to face the world alone. The weeks that followed carried a quiet transformation. What had once been a place haunted by uncertainty now thrummed with new energy. With the help of Senator William Callahan's gratitude, the restaurant received a shipment of gleaming new equipment, state-of-the-art ovens, sleek refrigerators, tools that made even seasoned chefs marvel. To Maria, each piece felt less like machinery and more like a gift, a promise that her work still mattered. She threw herself into the kitchen with renewed devotion. Her days stretched long, but she welcomed the hours. There was comfort in the rhythm of chopping vegetables, the perfume of herbs filling the air, the hiss of sauces simmering just right. For the first time in years, she no longer felt like she was simply surviving. She was creating again, shaping dishes with love rather than obligation. Customers noticed. Word spread quickly that the old restaurant had been reborn. Tables filled each night, laughter and conversation spilling from the dining room, the hum of life weaving itself back into the walls. Staff, once weary from late paychecks and tension, now worked with pride, their confidence returning as if the restaurant itself had taken a deep, cleansing breath. Maria moved among them, her presence steady, her voice calm. She was no longer just the woman who had carried the restaurant through storms. She was its heart. And though she remained humble, a spark of joy returned to her eyes, one that had been missing for far too long. David was never far from her side. He still had his moments of frustration, his self-deprecating humor, but something about him had changed too. The weight that had dragged him down seemed lighter, as if Maria's acceptance had steadied him in a way no amount of luck or charm ever could. He teased her endlessly about the new machines, claiming she spoke more tenderly to the ovens than to him. "They never talk back," she replied once, a smirk tugging at her lips. He clutched his chest dramatically. "So that's all it takes to win your affection? I'll keep my mouth shut from now on." Maria rolled her eyes, but the warmth in her smile betrayed her. Their banter filled the spaces between orders, and for the staff, it became a kind of reassurance. Proof that even in a world of debts and near losses, joy could be reclaimed. At night, when the last customer had gone and the chairs were stacked on tables, Maria would linger in the kitchen, polishing the new equipment until it shone. David would lean against the doorway, watching her with a fondness that no longer needed words. Sometimes he teased, sometimes he simply joined her, drying pans or wiping counters. They worked side by side, not out of duty, but out of choice. It was in those quiet moments that Maria realized how different life felt now. After years of giving everything to a place that had nearly slipped away, she was no longer afraid of what tomorrow might bring. The future was uncertain, yes, but it was theirs, and that was enough. One morning, as the city slowly stirred awake, David reached for her hand as they stepped outside. The rain had passed during the night, leaving the streets slick and gleaming under the pale sunrise. Portland's air was damp and cool, carrying the faint smell of coffee drifting from nearby cafes. They walked together down the block, their fingers intertwined, their steps unhurried. There was no need for grand declarations. The silence between them was full, steady, and content. Maria glanced at him, and in that moment, she didn't see the gambler who had nearly lost everything. She saw the man who had chosen to change, who had chosen her. And for the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to believe that happiness, late as it had come, was real. As the early light bathed them in soft gold, Maria and David kept walking, hand in hand, ready to begin again.